She walked into the Grand Hotel lobby, clutching her resume like a shield, her eyes lowered, praying no one would notice how nervous she felt. Emily had never been in a place so extravagant, polished marble floors, chandeliers like constellations, and guests who looked like they belonged in magazines. She was 21, shy, and completely inexperienced in every way that mattered. But life had left her no choice but to step outside her shell. She needed work desperately, and this upscale hotel was her last hope before eviction claimed her tiny apartment. As she approached the front desk, her hands trembled, but her voice somehow held when she asked, "Is the housekeeping supervisor available?" A tall man in a black suit stepped around the corner, stopping mid-stride as his gaze met hers intense, assessing, unreadable. He wasn't the supervisor, he was the owner, Alexander Pierce, a reclusive millionaire who rarely came downstairs. And in that fleeting moment, something stirred in both of them, though neither had the words for it yet. Alexander wasn't supposed to be in the lobby. He hated the noise, the people, the small talk, but something had pulled him down that day. Emily stood awkwardly as the receptionist stammered, unsure how to proceed under the unexpected gaze of the hotel's mysterious owner. "Come with me," Alexander said, his voice low and calm, not unkind, but firm enough to stop time. He led her to a private office without asking questions, just watching her with a curiosity even he didn't understand. She sat across from him, eyes lowered, fingers twisting nervously in her lap as he asked about her experience. "I've cleaned homes, cared for my sick mother, and I learned fast," she said softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. He saw something in her, a purity, a strength hidden behind timidity. Before she could finish, he said, "You're hired." Emily blinked in disbelief, unaware that her life had just shifted in a way neither of them could yet comprehend. Staff never set foot on the penthouse floor except those chosen personally by Mr. Pierce. Emily's first assignment was to clean the top level, where only silence and wealth resided. She walked slowly through the hall, overwhelmed by the art, the scent of cedar and leather, and the quiet that felt sacred. When she opened the door to his suite, she found it spotless, too spotless, like a place frozen in grief. Photos on the mantel showed a younger Alexander beside a woman who no longer smiled. She cleaned with care, never touching the framed memories, dusting gently, as if each object held a soul. Then she heard a sound behind her, the soft click of the door, and turned to find him watching her. He said nothing, but didn't leave either end for a long moment. They simply existed in the same silence. The staff whispered about her, the new girl, the virgin, the one who caught Mr. Pierce's eye. Emily heard them, but didn't respond. She wasn't there to flirt, only to survive. Still, it was hard to ignore the way his gaze lingered when she passed, or how his voice softened when he spoke only to her. She tried to stay invisible, keeping her head down and her heart guarded. But Alexander noticed everything: the way she avoided eye contact, the way she always tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous. He wasn't used to innocence. The world he lived in was cold, transactional, built on masks and silence. And the way she looked at the world with wonder and caution unnerved him more than any hostile boardroom ever had. He didn't understand it yet, but he was drawn to her, like something inside him had been waiting for someone like her to appear. It happened fast. One moment, Emily was carrying a tray of supplies, and the next she slipped on a spill in the hall. The sound of her body hitting the floor echoed off the marble, drawing staff from every direction. But it was Alexander who reached her first, kneeling beside her with genuine concern in his eyes. "You shouldn't be doing this alone," he said, helping her sit up as her cheeks burned with embarrassment. She insisted she was fine, but he escorted her to the infirmary anyway, his hand warm and steady on her back. As the nurse cleaned her scraped palm, he stood in the doorway, watching like someone who didn't know how to leave. Later that night, she found a handwritten note on her locker: "Rest tomorrow, full pay." It was the first time in years someone had cared without expecting anything in return. The next morning, she awoke to find she truly was off the schedule, replaced by someone else, just as the note had promised. She sat in the small cafe near the hotel, unsure what to do with time that wasn't survival. As if summoned by thought, Alexander appeared at the counter, ordering coffee like a man who never did such things. He noticed her, hesitated, then approached her table and asked, "Mind if I sit?" They talked awkward at first, then slowly opening, like windows letting in unfamiliar light. She learned he had been widowed 5 years ago and had never touched anyone since. He learned she had never known love, or even kindness in its true form, and without saying it aloud, they both realized they had been alone for far too long. Late one night, she found herself knocking on his door, not for romance, but because she couldn't sleep. He let her in without a word, as if he'd been waiting for her to appear. They sat on opposite sides of the room, shadows dancing on their faces as the fireplace cracked softly. "I'm not like the women you've known," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't want you to be," he replied, more truth in his words than she'd ever heard from a man. She admitted she'd never kissed anyone, never trusted someone enough to try. He said he hadn't kissed anyone since his wife died, and the space between them trembled with possibility. But they didn't kiss, not yet. That night, they simply shared silence, both braver than before. The next morning, the hotel manager pulled her aside with a stern face and cold tone. "You're not like the others," she said. "Don't get attached. He always goes cold again." Emily nodded, but inside her chest burned with quiet defiance. She wasn't there to be part of a scandal. Still, doubt crept in. Was she just another distraction to a man too lonely to know the difference? But when she saw Alexander later, he asked her to join him for dinner, not in his suite, but in the staff lounge. She agreed, heart pounding, and when they sat alone together, he didn't look at her like a man playing games. He looked like someone afraid to hope again, and somehow, that made her feel safe. Even if it ended tomorrow, she would not regret. These moments, they were hers, and no one else's. He surprised her with a box that evening, wrapped in silver paper and trembling silence. Inside was a simple navy blue dress, modest yet elegant, with a note, "You deserve to be seen." Emily stared at it for a long time before touching the fabric, afraid it would vanish like a dream. She wore it that night, her hands shaking. As she entered the lounge and found him waiting, Alexander stood as soon as he saw her, breath caught in his throat like she had stolen the very air. "You looked like yourself," he said, and it was the most honest compliment she had ever received. They sat and ate and laughed, the awkwardness slowly giving way to comfort. And as the night ended, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was what falling in love felt like. As she prepared to leave for the night, he stopped her at the door, hesitant and vulnerable. "I know this is sudden," he said, "but tomorrow, there's a gala. I'd like you to come with me." Emily froze, heart pounding louder than ever. He was asking her not as staff, but as something more. "I've never been to anything like that," she said, already imagining how people would stare. "I have," he replied, "and I've never wanted someone beside me more than I want you." She didn't answer right away, but the way her eyes softened told him she wasn't saying no. That night, she stared at the ceiling in her apartment, unsure whether to be terrified or thrilled, because she knew after tomorrow, nothing between them would be the same again. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and glittering gowns, a world far removed from the quiet places Emily knew. She stood near the entrance, holding Alexander's arm, every eye in the room finding its way to her. The whispers began, quickly. "Who is she? A maid? He brought her," but Alexander didn't flinch. "He introduced her not as a guest or employee, but simply as someone important to me." Emily tried to stay composed, but her fingers trembled slightly against his sleeve. He leaned in gently and whispered, "You're doing fine, and you look beautiful." They danced once slowly, carefully, and, though her body was nervous, her heart was calm in his hands. That night, under gold lights and cold stares, he made her feel like she belonged, but behind every moment of magic, the weight of truth pressed harder. Back at the hotel, the staff murmured louder, and rumors twisted into cruel assumptions. Emily began to feel eyes on her, not just from jealousy, but from disbelief. How could she be with him? Alexander tried to shield her, but the walls of his world weren't built for someone so innocent. Even the board of his company raised concerns, questioning his judgment and whispering about vulnerability. She overheard one executive say, "Men like him always fall hardest for the ones who break them." It was never meant to be this complicated, but their feelings weren't casual anymore. And when she cried quietly one night in her room, he stood outside her door, unsure whether to go in or give her space. Emily had never told anyone what her childhood had been like, how silence had been her only friend, raised by an aunt who called her a burden and a father who never came back. She grew up hiding in corners. Her virginity was never a moral choice, it was just that no one had ever made her feel safe enough. When Alexander asked gently, "Have you ever been in love before?" she hesitated and answered, "No, but I think I'm learning." She expected judgment, pity, maybe even discomfort, but he only took her hand and kissed her knuckles. "I don't need experience," he said. "I need honesty, and I've never met anyone more honest than you." For the first time, she let herself believe that maybe her past didn't make her unworthy. Maybe it just made her ready for the right kind of love. But while she opened up, Alexander began to close off. One night, a letter arrived from someone he hadn't seen in years, his late wife's sister. She wanted to meet, to discuss the future. Though her tone was cold and calculated, Emily noticed the shift immediately, how he grew quieter, more guarded, how his gaze sometimes drifted far away. She didn't ask at first, fearing the answer, but part of her heart already ached. When he finally told her, it wasn't with emotion, but with apology. "She thinks you're a mistake," he said quietly. "She thinks I'm ruining everything my wife left behind." And Emily, brave in her soft way, whispered, "Then show her that I'm not." The meeting was arranged in the penthouse, and Emily chose to stay despite everything and her telling her to run. The woman arrived dressed in expensive coldness, her words sharp and eyes dismissive. "I see she's very sweet," she said, barely looking at Emily. "But sweetness fades. Reputations don't." Alexander stood tall, defending Emily without raising his voice, making it clear he wouldn't be shamed. But it was Emily who surprised them both when she spoke not loudly, but clearly. "I didn't take anything from her memory. I just gave him room to live again." The woman said nothing after that, only left with a tense nod and a look that said the war wasn't over. But Emily didn't tremble this time. She had found her voice, and Alexander saw her differently because of it. That night, Alexander disappeared, no note, no call, just silence that felt too familiar. Emily waited, heartbreaking in slow, steady pieces, wondering if she had pushed him too far. He returned hours later, smelling of rain and regret, eyes glassy with emotion he didn't know how to name. "I don't know if I can love you the way you deserve," he said, voice cracking. She stepped forward anyway, placing her hand over his heart. "Then love me the way you can. That's all I ever wanted." They stood in the doorway like that, the past pressing hard against the present, and when he finally held her, it wasn't as a man saving her but as a man being saved. For the first time, they slept in the same bed, clothed, holding each other, learning how safety truly felt. The days that followed were soft, slow, and sacred. They shared breakfasts and quiet talks, glances that grew longer, and touches that lingered. Emily began leaving notes for him, small things like "don't skip lunch," or "today felt warm, thank you." He responded with books left on her cart, hand-picked songs, and once, a sketch of her asleep on the lounge chair. They weren't lovers, yet not physically, but their connection was deeper than touch. Still, something inside her stirred now. When he brushed against her, something she didn't yet know how to handle. She found herself imagining what it would feel like to be truly close, to give everything. And Alexander, watching her from across the room, knew the moment was coming. But it had to be on her terms. He invited her to the countryside house for a weekend, just the two of them. No staff, no interruptions. She hesitated, knowing what such a trip could mean, but she nodded, heart full of courage and quiet fear. They drove in silence for hours, but it was a comfortable silence, full of shared anticipation. The cottage was warm, surrounded by trees and soft winds, a world far removed from gossip and gold. That night, they cooked together, laughed more than they had in weeks, and sat by the fireplace with wine. He looked at her, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, and said, "We don't have to rush." But Emily shook her head, heart racing. "I know, but I don't want to wait forever." That night she opened her heart and maybe her body for the first time in her life. It was nothing like the stories she'd heard, no rush, no pressure, no performance. He kissed her slowly, like she was a song he didn't want to finish. They moved carefully, asking with eyes before touching, giving more than taking. She trembled, but not with fear, with trust, with the sacred weight of letting go. When he finally held her fully, she felt both seen and shielded, like she had stepped into something eternal. There were moments when she teared up, and he paused. Every time, brushing kisses over her eyelids. They didn't sleep until the sun began to rise, wrapped in each other like warmth itself. And she knew this wasn't just her first night. It was the beginning of something forever. They woke tangled in sheets and sunlight, hearts still beating in rhythm from the night before. Alexander looked at her like she was both miracle and mystery, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, and she nodded, overwhelmed but whole. They stayed in bed most of the morning, talking about nothing and everything. He made breakfast shirtless, fumbling with eggs while she laughed like she hadn't in years. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, whispering, "I've never felt safer." He turned, kissed her forehead, and said, "Then I'll make sure you always do." But neither of them knew storm clouds were already forming in the distance. When they returned from the countryside, everything felt different. The walls of the hotel seemed colder. Emily walked with a quiet glow, and the staff noticed. Eyes followed her like rumors waiting to be reborn. Someone had seen them leave, together. And now everyone talked about the trip, about her, about why Alexander tried to shield her again. But this time, the pressure came from his board. "You've changed," one executive said. "She's compromising your judgment, your brand, your legacy." He ignored them, but Emily felt the weight of being the reason he had to defend his heart. She began pulling away quietly, not because she wanted to but because she feared destroying the man she loved. And when he asked, "What's wrong?" she smiled weakly and said, "Nothing. I just need some space." That evening, Alexander sat alone in his study, staring at a small velvet box he had hidden for weeks. He had planned to with grand gestures, but with quiet sincerity and a vow to protect what they had built. But now, the doubt in her voice echoed louder than the words in his heart. He closed the box slowly, wondering if love was enough to overcome a world that never stopped judging. Meanwhile, Emily walked the city streets alone, wondering if she had made a mistake by stepping into his world. She passed by a jewelry store and stared at a ring in the window, not knowing one was waiting for her, just out of reach. They slept in separate rooms that night, though only a few walls stood between them, and neither could close their eyes without wondering where things had gone wrong. A week later, as Emily cleaned the suite in silence, a young woman appeared in the doorway dressed like elegance with a cruel smile. "I'm Lauren," she said, walking in without permission. "I used to be his before he fell for you." Emily froze, unsure whether to reply or run, but Lauren only looked her up and down and scoffed. "He always chooses the broken ones. He loves fixing things that don't last." Emily tried to stay calm, but the woman's words cut deeper than she expected. "You should leave while he still pities you," Lauren whispered, then walked out like poison in heels. That night, Emily said nothing to Alexander, afraid he might not deny it or worse, confirm it. And in the silence between them, fear bloomed. like a secret no one wanted to say aloud, that it was their first real argument, not about what had happened, but about what hadn't been said. Alexander noticed how distant she'd become, and when he asked why, she finally let the pain spill out. Do you love me because I'm Millionaire, because I make you feel needed? He stood stunned, heart breaking in slow cracks, realizing she still didn't see herself the way he did. I love you because you remind me what being alive feels like, he said, voice raw. Because you're not like anyone else. But she was crying now, overwhelmed by the fear that love wasn't enough in a world built on power and judgment. I don't want to be your escape, she whispered. I want to be your choice. He reached for her, but she stepped back, and that night, for the first time, they didn't say goodnight. When he awoke the next morning, she was gone. No note, no call, just the emptiness of her absence. He searched every corner of the hotel, called her phone again and again, but it rang into silence. In the break room beneath her locker door, a folded note waited. I'm not strong enough for your world yet. I need to learn how to stand on my own, so one day I can stand with you. It wasn't goodbye, but it wasn't a promise either. He read it twice, then placed it in his wallet like a wound he refused to hide. Outside, rain poured over the city again, reminding him of the first time he saw her. And for the first time since she arrived, the penthouse felt truly cold again. Days became weeks, and she vanished into a quieter life, a rented room, a part-time job, no whispers or golden halls. Emily took evening classes, read poetry, and wrote letters she never sent. She missed him terribly, but she also learned to miss herself less. Everywhere she went, she imagined him beside her, ordering bad coffee, tying her scarf, brushing her cheek. Alexander buried himself in work, but nothing filled the space she left behind. He walked the halls slower now, lingered where she used to clean, hoping to find even a shadow of her scent. His world had everything, but without her, it meant nothing. And every night, he reread her letter, waiting for the day she might come back. One afternoon, while checking her email at a library terminal, a new message appeared from a name she didn't recognize. It was the housekeeper from the hotel, an older woman who had always smiled at her in passing. The message was short. He hasn't smiled since you left. Whatever he told the world, he never stopped waiting. Emily stared at the screen, heart pounding, unsure whether to respond or to cry. She closed the window, but later that night, she opened it again. She replied with a simple line, "Tell him, I remember everything." The next morning, a delivery arrived at her door, a single navy blue dress, the same one from their first real night, and beneath it, a note. I've kept the music playing, even in silence. Come back when you're ready. She stood outside the hotel's glass doors, heart in her throat, fingers trembling like they had the first day. The lobby hadn't changed, but she had. As she stepped inside, the staff turned to look, but this time there was awe, not mockery. Alexander stood by the elevators, as if he had known she'd arrive at that exact moment. He didn't rush to her. He waited, arms at his sides, eyes locked to hers like gravity itself. She walked up slowly, then whispered, I didn't stop loving we, I just had to learn how to love me, too. He smiled, tears in his eyes, and said, then now, we can love each other right. And as the elevator doors closed behind them, the world outside faded into something far less important. He brought her not to the penthouse, but to a small, sunlit suite she had never seen before. It was quiet, peaceful, filled with books, plants, and the soft scent of her favorite tea. This is yours, he said. Not mine, not ours, yours. A place where you never have to disappear. She walked the room in awe, each corner holding signs of how well he'd come to know her. By the window, there was a canvas and paints, brand new, untouched, waiting for her hands. Paint something here, he said softly, and leave your mark like you did on my life. She turned to him, tears shimmering, and whispered, this is home. And when he kissed her, it wasn't desperate or afraid, it was full of forever. They sat by the fire that night, not needing to speak, just resting in the quiet rhythm of being known. Her head rested on his chest, and she could hear the heartbeat that had waited for her. He didn't promise perfection, only presence, and she didn't promise ease, only honesty. Together, they had survived fear, judgment, distance, and doubt. And now, all that remained was the love that stayed. Emily looked up at him and said, maybe the first night wasn't what we expected, but this is what I hoped for. And he smiled, kissing her forehead. This is what I prayed for. Alexander invited her to dinner, not at a restaurant, not in a hotel suite, but at his childhood home. It was a quiet estate outside the city, where memories of his late wife once lingered like dust on glass. Emily wore a soft green dress and brought a small bouquet, her fingers trembling just slightly. His sister greeted her warmly, and his mother, cautiously. But as the night went on, Emily didn't try to impress. She simply spoke with kindness, listened, laughed honestly. By dessert, his mother said, she makes you smile like you used to, and Alexander took Emily's hand beneath the table. It wasn't about approval, but it felt like a door unlocking inside his family. And inside him, for the first time, the past didn't feel like a rival, it felt like something they'd survived together. Love had always felt temporary to Emily, like a kindness that came with an expiration date. But now, she found herself doing something new. Staying? She got used to breakfast with him, reading on the same couch, sharing silence without discomfort. There were still small things to overcome, like how she flinched when people raised their voices, or how he sometimes disappeared into thought. But they had learned to ask, not assume, to pause, not push. One night he found her crying quietly, not because she was sad, but because she finally felt safe. He didn't try to fix it, he just held her and said, "You don't have to be brave with me." And somehow, that made her braver than ever before. One afternoon, a number she hadn't seen in years lit up her phone screen. Her father? She almost let it ring out, but something in her said she needed to hear his voice, even just once. He apologized clumsily, spoke of regret like it weighed more than words could carry. She didn't forgive him right away, but she didn't hang up either. Alexander sat beside her, holding her hand through the silence. When the call ended, she wept not for him, but for the girl she used to be. And in Alexander's arms, she realized healing wasn't about fixing the past, it was about feeling free from it. He kissed her forehead and said, "Whatever hurts you, you never have to face it alone again." He didn't plan something grand, no fireworks, no staged moments. Instead, it happened one morning on the rooftop garden he'd built just for her. She came up holding tea and found him kneeling between the roses, a simple ring in his hand. "I don't need perfection," he said. "I just want to be beside you while we both keep growing." Tears filled her eyes, not from surprise but from knowing she had finally arrived at her forever. She didn't shout or cry or stumble, she simply whispered, "Yes," and smiled like peace itself. He slipped the ring on her finger, then kissed her slowly under the soft breeze. And high above the noise of the world, they sealed a promise made not of diamonds, but of truth. They didn't rush the wedding, each step was thoughtful, personal, a quiet celebration of survival. Emily chose a small guest list. People who had truly seen her, truly stayed. Alexander found a country chapel with stained glass and vines curling at the windows. They wrote their vows together, not to impress, but to reflect exactly what they had lived through. There were moments of stress, fittings, decisions, doubts, but never about each other. He reminded her, "The day is just a day, but us. That's every day after." And when she stood in front of the mirror in her gown, she didn't think about being beautiful. She thought about being whole and how far she had come. She walked down the aisle with no father beside her, only a quiet song and her own steady feet. Alexander stood waiting, eyes wet, hands folded like prayer. Their vows were simple but unforgettable. She promised to be soft where the world had hardened him, and he promised to be gentle where the world had bruised her. When the minister said, "You may kiss," he didn't like it was the first and last time all at once. Guests cried, laughed, clapped, but Emily heard none of it, only his breath, only his warmth. They walked out hand in hand, not just married, but transformed. And in that moment, the girl who had once been invisible became someone unforgettable, and the man who hadn't touched anyone in years found a reason to hold on forever. They didn't fly to Paris or the Maldives. Instead, they returned to the same countryside cottage where they first learned how to love each other. They cooked together again, danced barefoot on old wood floors, and spent hours doing nothing but laughing. He gave her a book of flowers from every place she had ever smiled. She gave him a drawing of the two of them, sitting on the porch, aged content, holding hands. They made love slowly, reverently, like the world didn't exist beyond their touch. And every night, he whispered, "Thank you for finding me." And every morning, she whispered back, "Thank you for seeing me." One afternoon, while he was out in the garden, she sat by the window and began writing. It was a letter not to him, but to the girl she used to be. She wrote about the fear, the silence, the feeling of not being enough. She wrote about love, how it wasn't loud or instant, but slow and sacred. She ended the letter with, "You were always worthy. You just had to find someone who saw it too." She folded it gently, sealed it, and placed it in a journal she'd never show anyone else. Then she walked outside, hugged Alexander from behind, and smiled against his back. Because she no longer needed to be rescued, she had rescued herself. Months later, she stood in the bathroom, staring at two faint lines that changed everything. She held her breath, then her belly, then the memory of that first night in his arms. When she told him, he fell silent, then dropped to his knees and kissed her stomach like it was holy. "I didn't think I could have more love in me," he whispered, "but somehow, I do." They planned, slowly choosing names, building a nursery, writing lullabies only they would ever hear. And at night, they read stories aloud, so the child would know they were already surrounded by love. Emily sometimes cried not out of fear, but from the beauty of getting to begin again. And Alexander, once a man untouched by anything, now found himself transformed by everything. Years passed, and the hotel remained, but their home was now the place where laughter lived loudest. A child with eyes like hers and dimples like his ran through the garden chasing butterflies. Emily painted again, sometimes on canvas, sometimes on walls, sometimes on paper scraps tucked into his pockets. Alexander held her each night like the world might fall apart if he didn't. They still fought sometimes, still healed, still chose each other every morning, and in the room where it all began, she left one more note. "We made it." They had walked through doubt, through pain, through silence and fear, and They had built something louder than both their pasts. And that first night, the one that changed everything, had led them to a forever neither of them had dared to dream.